Hey friends, this is Jim here with Science Talk, and I want to discuss with you this article that appeared at the end of 2021, the 7th of December. It appeared in the journal Nature Communications, and it's a very detailed article, especially get into a section on molecular material. I'm not going to go over that with you, but I will leave the URL link in the comment sections for those who do wish to read further. You can do so at your leisure. So, what is this article here? What is it discussing? The thawing Yedoma permafrost is a neglected nitrous oxide source. That's N2O. And you can see there's quite a few authors on here. The lead author is Marishak. And nitrous oxide, of course, is N2O, right? And I've done previous video segments where I discussed how nitrous oxide is being released as the permafrost thaws. In other words, it is a greenhouse gas. And when I did the video on the annual greenhouse gas index that NOAA puts out every year, part of their analyses, and I covered it in depth in that video, was nitrous oxide. So let's take a look at the abstract. In contrast to the well-recognized permafrost carbon, see, feedback to climate change, the fate of permafrost nitrogen and after thaw is poorly understood. According to mounting evidence, part of the nitrogen liberated from permafrost may be released to the atmosphere as a strong greenhouse gas nitrous oxide. Here we report post-thaw N2O release from late Pleistocene permafrost deposits called Yedoma, which store a substantial part of permafrost carbon and nitrogen and are highly vulnerable to thaw. So basically, there's a lot of it, and it's at risk of thawing, which means not only the methane, but also the nitrous oxide. Loads of it could be released into the atmosphere, further aggravating the already heavily warming process currently underway. While freshly thawed, unvegetated Yedoma, in disturbed areas emit little N2O emissions, increase within few years after stabilization, drying, and revegetation with grasses to high rates. And then they give, 548, that's the median. And then 133 to 6,286, that's the range of micrograms of nitrogen per square meter per day. In other words, this is a flux. Right? So this is a flux rate, a concentration or an amount per unit area volume per unit time. And this is exceeded by 1 to 2 orders of magnitude the typical rates from permafrost affected soils. And then it's using targeted metagenomics of key nitrogen cycling genes. We link the increase in C2 N2O emissions with structural changes of the microbial community responsible for nitrogen cycling. Our results highlight the importance of extra nitrogen availability from the thawing Yedoma permafrost, causing a positive climate feedback from the Arctic in the form of N2O emissions. Positive climate feedback. We know what that means. Exponentiation. Okay, I'll cover briefly here what we got in the introduction. Rapid Arctic warming and associated permafrost thaw are threatening the large carbon and nitrogen reservoirs of northern permafrost soils, accumulated under cold conditions where the decomposition rate of soil organic matter, abbreviated as SOM, is low. Permafrost thaw is now increasingly exposing these long-term inert carbon and nitrogen pools through microbial decomposition and transformation processes. While it is long known that mobilization of permafrost carbon potentially increased the release of greenhouse gases, basically CO2 and methane, the fate of soil liberated upon permafrost thaw is poorly studied and more complex. There is evidence that part of liberated nitrogen may be emitted to the atmosphere as nitrogenous gases, typically N2O, which is about 300 times more powerful than CO2 over a 100-year time horizon and a dominant contributor to ozone destruction in the stratosphere. So N2O is, when looked over a 100-year time frame, is about 300 times more powerful than CO2, and you have the extra bonus of it basically destroying the ozone in the stratosphere. So more UV radiation, more sunburn, more skin cancer. Yeehaw! So and, so this is why we see an N2O in the AGGI. We know methane is considerably stronger than CO2 over even, say, a 20-year period. Right? So very strong greenhouse gases, CO2, methane, and N2O. Okay. The current increase in atmospheric uh, N2O concentration is mainly driven by the growth of human-induced emissions, which comprise 43% of the global N2O emissions of 17 teragrams of nitrogen per year and are dominated by N2O release from fertilized agricultural soils. Notice all the fertilizers, in industrial agriculture, or even if you throw little fertilizers down in your own vegetable patch that you're growing, right? You go buy the fertilizer at the feed store, for example, and you got three numbers on there, right? You got potassium, nitrogen, and phosphorus, right? And that tells you the ratios, et cetera, et cetera. But we're adding this stuff in there. Some of it may get washed out into the water, goes into the marine ecosystem. Gets some stays in the soil, what have you. But it's all being reacted upon. Nitrous oxide emissions, although generally smaller per unit area, occur also from soils under natural vegetation, with a 33% contribution to the total of global N2O emissions. Tropical soils with high nitrogen turnover rate generally show the largest N2O emissions among natural soil, while permafrost affected soils in cold environments have been thought to be negligible N2O sources. This view was challenged by a recent synthesis showing that N2O emissions commonly occur from permafrost soils, with global emissions between 0.08 and 1.27 teragrams of nitrogen per year, meaning an additional 1 to 23% to the global N2O emissions from natural soils. And they go on to say this is uncertain. Okay, so late Pleistocene age Yedoma permafrost occurs as deep deposits, a mean thickness of about 19 meters over an area of greater than 1 million square kilometers in the northern hemisphere. The Yedoma region contains greater than 25% of the circumarctic permafrost carbon stock and a yet unaccounted for and likely even larger proportion of permafrost nitrogen due to the low carbon to nitrogen ratio of Yedoma soil organic matter. The SOM in Yedoma is thought to be easily decomposable because it was incorporated into the permafrost soon after deposition without having much time to be degraded. The high ice content of Yedoma makes it vulnerable for abrupt thaw and ground collapse, allowing rapid mobilization of soil, carbon, and nitrogen stocks after thaw. I'll go briefly through the nitrogen cycle. Mobilization means basically freeing up carbon and nitrogen into a gaseous form that goes into the atmosphere. Immobilization is basically removing it, and locking it up in, say, organic tissues. Along Arctic rivers and the coastal zone of the Arctic shelf, thawing of Yedoma permafrost creates steep, tens of meters high Yedoma exposures, where many of the conditions known to promote N2O emissions from permafrost affected soils are met, including low carbon nitrogen ratios, lack of vegetation, and suitable soil moisture content for microbial processes producing N2O. Okay. Now, want to back up a little bit and then do a little sidestep here. I want to go back to this up here and do a little explanation as to what's going on here. It said freshly thawed, unvegetated Yedoma in disturbed areas emit little N2O. Emissions increase within few years after stabilization, drying, and revegetation with grasses to high rates. In other words, when you have the thawing, but then when vegetation moves in, or the community settles down, what have you, after a few years when these processes have taken place, then we see a high rate of emissions. In other words, and I'll get to this later, that it's the activities of the plant community, the vegetative community, that helps increase the emissions of nitrous oxide to the atmosphere. In other words, they work. Now we have the soil thawed out, so they can work on the organic material that's there. Now, this 548, that's the median. Now, notice it says median, not the mean. The median is the value that occurs smack dab in the middle of all the data. So, in other words, the median is the 50th percentile. Half of the data is less than this value. Half the data is greater than this value. So then you have this range here, 133 to 6,286 micrograms, right, etc., nitrogen per square meter per day. That's the range. And that's going to differ based on what type of substrate you're looking at, the type of vegetation there, and as later on, as we'll discuss, the moisture content. So I want just to stress this is median, not mean. Okay. Before we go any further, you're going to see a lot of terminology here. So I want to just quickly, and I mean quickly, go over the nitrogen cycle, because you can spend weeks in an introductory ecology class, as part of the biogeochemical cycling section there. You can spend weeks just analyzing and studying the basic nitrogen cycle. So let's start here first with the diagram of natural cycle. So you got nitrogen in the atmosphere, about 79% of it. As it turns out, elemental nitrogen, with very few exceptions, cannot be directly utilized by primary producers. So you have to fix it in some form. Lightning can do that, or you have specific bacteria that will fix that. Right? So then you have the bacteria to fix it. Eventually you get nitrates and nitrites versus nitrites and nitrates. Plants utilize it, you get plant protein. Animals eat the plants. They die. It goes back in to the soil, and you've got a whole bunch of other microbes doing their thing, making amino acids, ammonia, urea, etc. You have mineralization, immobilization. I'm going to explain these two terms shortly. So this is your cycle, and then some of it goes right back into the atmosphere. Some of it stays in substrate where it can then be compacted down, and this is how the material can accumulate, and then if you have permafrost, as we're just considering here, it gets frozen, compacted, and then as it starts thawing out, it's then acted upon. Okay, another quick little diagram here. Nitrogen fixation, you get nitrogen fixing bacteria that creates ultimately ammonia. Then you have the nitrifying bacteria that ultimately creates nitrites and nitrates that goes into the plants, right? That's this here. So we have assimilation, basically, protein, tissues, that sort of stuff here. Then you get denitrification, helps release the nitrogen as a gas back into the atmosphere. Again, a very general overview. So let's look at some of the specific steps involved. Okay? So what is the nitrogen cycle? It's the biogeochemical process through which nitrogen is converted into many forms, goes from the atmosphere to the soil to organisms, back to the soil, back to the atmosphere. Involves nitrogen fixation, nitrification, denitrification, decay, putrefaction, mineralization, immobilization, etc. So the first step is nitrogen fixation. Okay, so you take atmospheric nitrogen, and ultimately the form is you end up with ammonia, and then ammonia as the ammonium NH4 plus ion. And there's bacteria to do that. I just want to show you the major steps involved. So you start with nitrogen. You eventually end up with ammonia or ammonium. And you take that ammonium and you nitrify it. Nitrification. Because ammonium is poisonous to plants. They can't use that. So we need to convert that ammonia into first nitrite and then nitrate. So nitrification is that process. The ammonia is converted into nitrate by more bacteria. Okay. And so basically you take the ammonium, you mix it with oxygen, NO2 with the negative, that is the nitrite, Nitrite ion. It releases hydrogen and water. Then you take that nitrite, further react with oxygen to get the NO3 with a minus charge, nitrate ion. That nitrate ion is what plants use, and the plants use that to make proteins, because proteins contain nitrogen. And you can also make amines and amides, other groups there. But this is critical to making the proteins, which then comprise tissues. And then, so the plants are able to make their tissues. Heterotrophs, such as herbivores, will graze upon the plants, and then they incorporate it, etc., etc. Okay, and that's what assimilation is, right? The plants take that nitrate and they make their compounds. It gets into the food web. Now, when the plants and the animals die, the nitrogen present in the organic matter is released back into the soil, and the decomposers take that organic matter and convert it back into ammonium, which then leads into ammonia, which is then, used for other biological processes, such as, nitrification. Now, denitrification is the process in which the nitrogen compounds eventually make their way into the atmosphere by converting that nitrate into the gaseous nitrogen, which is technically N2. This process of the nitrogen cycle is the final stage and occurs in the absence of oxygen. So basically like anaerobic bacteria. And they go on to nitrogen cycle in the marine ecosystem. That's very complex. We're not going to go there right now. So what's the importance of nitrogen cycle? Helps plants synthesize chlorophyll from the nitrogen compound. Helps converting inert nitrogen gas into a usable form. In the process of ammonification, the bacteria help in decomposing animal plant matter, which indirectly cleans up the environment. Nitrates are released into the soil, which helps enrich the soil with necessary nutrients. Nitrogen is an integral part of the cell and forms many crucial compounds important biomolecules. And then they go and make some conclusions here. Nitrogen is abundant in the atmosphere, but it's unusable, so you have to fix it. And they fix it first into ammonia, which is then other bacteria is converted into nitrogen compound that can be used by a plant. The plants absorb that, goes through the food web, etc., and then it eventually makes its way back into the atmosphere. But some of it stays in the ground. So now I want to give you some definitions here. Mineralization, immobilization. Nitrogen in mineralization is the conversion of organic nitrogen to inorganic forms of nitrogen. It's part of the microbial degradation of nitrogen-rich organic matter. Organic nitrogen comprises about 90% of total nitrogen in most soils. It includes biomass, proteins, detritus, and humics. The most important, and they go on to identify, the enzyme classes. For example, deaminases. Okay, ASE is an ending signifying an enzyme, and amine is a group of organic compounds containing nitrogen and has a certain functional group. And deaminase is basically you break down the amines. And so you got like orthoglycosidase or whatever. Okay. The reverse process of mineralization is immobilization. Now, immobilization means you're taking this inorganic nitrogen and you're fixing it in organic compounds, basically that helps form tissues. So it's immobilized in the tissue in the organisms. Right? And as it says, they assimilate the inorganic nitrogen for the synthesis of proteins. That's all I want to say. They talk about mineralization versus immobilization. Which one is greater? Okay, I'm giving you definitions here. So this one talks about a little further. They go through the same process of the nitrogen cycle, but I wanted to show you this paragraph here. Denitrification, process in which nitrate ion NO3 is reduced to nitrogen dioxide, dinitrogen oxide, N2O. This is the nitrous oxide. And also it can break it down to nitrogen monoxide or simply nitrogen gas. And this nitrogen is liberated into the atmosphere. So when we talked about earlier in general terms, denitrification eventually releases nitrogen. Well, you also can release these other gases, NO2, N2O, and NO. And sometimes some of that material does not get acted upon. It gets compressed. Sometimes it gets frozen, as in the case of permafrost, and then it's acted upon later when it's exposed and it starts to thaw out, and then you get plants and bacteria, and they start working on it. So the N2O that we are considering in the study that we're examining today is a result of denitrification process. As I said, very quick overview of the nitrogen cycle, but it's important to get an idea of the processes involved. Okay, back to the main show. So now let's look at the overview of the studied Yedoma exposures. So I have a little color coding here. The Yedoma deposits are indicated by this brownish color. As you can see, there's quite a bit of it. Okay? Most of it is within the Arctic Circle. A lot of it appears on the Eurasian side, the Siberia side. You have the darkest blue here is continuous permafrost, such as what we see here in this region here, the North Slope of Alaska. North Slope of Alaska contains Yedoma deposits, right? And so on here. Then this middle shade of blue is discontinuous permafrost, such as what we see right here. And then you have sporadic permafrost. This extremely lightly colored bluish region. So discontinuous permafrost means, as the name implies, you have stretches where there's permafrost, you have stretches where there's no permafrost. Continuous means the whole bloody ground is frozen. And sporadic is on a frequency basis less than discontinuous. So this is showing the distribution of these different formations, and you can see how extensive this type of permafrost is. Okay. Here's the Mackenzie River, the Slave River. Okay, here's the Yukon River, to the north slope of Alaska. There's the peninsula, Nome, Kotzebue's there, and so on. Okay, so now we have an idea of where they studied. I want to point out the Kurungnak and the Duvani Yar are the two major sites that they considered. And they show you some photos of it. And by the way, this white material here, those are ice lenses thawing out. The ice will, of course, melt because it undergoes a phase change. The ground simply thaws. There's a nice big ice lens right there. So B, that's this one here, is showing the Kurungnak exposure, and C is the Duvani Yar exposure. So they go on to explain that they studied N2 fluxes on two thawing Yedoma exposures, the ones we just mentioned, forming retrogressive thaw slumps in northeast Siberia. Okay, so they measured the N2O fluxes with static chamber technique, etc., etc. So let's get right to the results and the discussion. And again, I'm going to just hit the highlights here. They get into extreme detail. My point in sharing this with you is that this is a huge source of not just CO2 and CH4, but N2O, which there seems to be quite a bit of it. And it's being released. And we know that as the air continues to warm, the thawing rates will increase. The release of these materials, these chemicals, will continue to increase. We got a runaway positive feedback system, right? The exponentiation is exponentiating. The acceleration is accelerating. And this will lead to warmer atmospheric conditions, increasing the warming of the planet, which is another factor, as I have argued before, that leads us to a 5 to 11 C increase by the end of this century. The N2O emission showed an increasing trend along the measuring transect from the densely vegetated Holocene cover deposits overlying intact permafrost on the top of the riverbank through the actively eroding upper part of the Yedoma exposure down to the already stabilized lower part of the slope revegetated by mosses and grasses. The highest N2O emissions occurred from Yedoma, which had thawed between 5 and 10 years ago. And they refer you to the supplementary methods. For those who are interested, I'll leave that to you. And they were revegetated by grasses, 548 micrograms of nitrogen per square meter per day. This is what was reported in the abstract. This value and ranges right there. The emissions from these revegetated Yedoma soils in the mid part of the slope was significantly higher than the emissions from undisturbed vegetated Holocene cover and bare, freshly thawed Yedoma deposits. Negligible N2O fluxes were detected from bare sand on the river shore that receives meltwaters from the thawing Yedoma exposure above. Okay, let's look at these at figure 2. Now, the first thing I want to point out to you, okay, to giving you the flux here, okay, now they're reporting as milligrams of nitrogen per square meter per day. Note that this is a logarithmic scale. on the y-axis. Vegetated Holocene cover, as they just described above here, the permafrost is intact. It's frozen. Right? Barely freshly thawed. And then, maybe a little earlier, and then we get to where it's revegetated with mosses or with grasses. And we see clearly this is where we get the highest rates. Very low rates here, all throughout. Very low rates. Now, the brown, of course, is the Kurunnak deposit, and the blue is from the Devani Yar. See, very low here, but we're seeing a lot from the Kurunnak. Now, the WFPS, the percentage, is referring to the moisture content, basically. Okay? So they describe it in the soil moisture expressed as water-filled pore space. Water-filled pore space. And once again, we see that the percentage, this is water, not ice, right? Different phases. So if you still have intact permafrost, not too much water necessarily will be found. When you get to the thawed out areas, or the area has been revegetated, well, it's thawing out. That means the ice has melted. So of course we expect to see a high water percentage. And by the way, these are commonly called cat and whisker plots. This dark horizontal line is the median. This, and you got a box here. This box represents 50% of the data. Notice this underlying horizontal line here is the 25th percentile. This upper horizontal line is the 75th percentile. This is often referred to as the IQR, the interquartile range between the 25th and 75th percentile. 75 minus 25 is 50. 50% of the data. This is the median. That's the 50th percentile. This little tail here is the lowest value, and this tail here on the upper end is the highest value recorded. So you get what's called a 5-number summary. The lowest value, 25th percentile, 50th percentile, 75th percentile, and then the highest range. So you can see that, this is the water-filled pore space. And then the nitrate content, okay, milligrams of nitrogen, and they do this in kilogram of DW, is dry weight. And we see that the earlier thawed Yedoma and the revegetated from the second site, right, the Devani Yar, has a lot of nitrogen. There's a lot of potential there for what can be released. So that's basically what these figures are showing. Then they did some lab testing to kind of verify the results from the field. And then they looked at the nitrogen production, nanograms of nitrogen in terms of grams of dry weight per hour. And they looked at anoxic and anoxic with acetylene. This gets into a lot of chemistry. Not my focus here, but you can see why I wanted to discuss with you the terms, what's meant by mineralization. Okay. Basically breaking down the organic material back into inorganic nitrogen. So let's look at what they had here. The N2O fluxes at the Devani Yar exposure were less variable and lower than at the Kurunnak exposure. The highest N2O emissions were again detected from thawed and revegetated Yedoma surfaces, but this time from those with mosses. There, the N2O emissions were significantly higher than from bare, freshly thawed Yedoma. Further, we found elevated N2O concentrations compared to, and the mean was plus or minus standard deviation, 2.4 plus or minus 2.1 parts per million, compared to atmospheric N2O concentration of 0.33 parts per million. Then they proceed to give estimates. The fluxes from the permafrost affected soils were generally fluxes from the thawed and revegetated Yedoma in the Kurungnak was higher than the fluxes from permafrost affected soils in general. Some important aspects here. Uptake of atmospheric N2O is commonly observed in wetland soil where energetically more favorable electron acceptors, such as O2 and O3, are absent. Nitrous oxide production relies on mineral nitrogen supply in excess of the immediate needs of microbes and plants. High latitude soils usually have a low content of mineral nitrogen species, particularly NO3. Now, I just showed that to you, that NO3 is important for plants to uptake to make tissues. So therefore, that's going to limit primary productivity. If nitrate is limited, primary productivity will be limited. And therefore, ultimately, it will limit N2O emissions at the end of the day. At the Kurungnak exposure, only the high-emitting revegetated Yedoma surfaces had measurable NO3 content, while no NO3 was detected elsewhere. The opposite spatial pattern in ammonium, NH4 content, could reflect high ammonium consumption by nitrification in thawed and revegetated Yedoma. In Devani Yar, nitrate ion content was generally low, except in bare and moss-covered thermal karst mounds called Bizorox, where high nitrate content up to 100 milligrams of nitrogen dry weight was found. Strong NO3 accumulation indicates high nitrification activities in this dry, well-aerated soil and availability of precursors for N2O production by anaerobic denitrification in deeper water-saturated soil layers or after rain events. Okay, this is an important section here. The effect of moisture and vegetation on N2O fluxes and nitrogen transformation rates. In previous studies, the highest emission rates of N2O from permafrost-affected soil have been found from soils without living plant cover, such as bare peat surfaces of permafrost, peatlands, or retrogressive thaw slumps lacking vegetation. The main reason behind the generally higher emissions from unvegetated versus vegetated soils is obvious. When plants are not taking up nitrogen from soil, the reactive nitrogen forms are entirely available for microbial activities and growth, including the microbial nitrogen transformation producing N2O. So why did the highest emissions in this study occur at sites revegetated after thaw and not from bare parts of the exposure as expected? Possible explanation for the high N2O emissions from the revegetated compared to the bare locations could be that plant colonization indicates stabilization of the thawing Yedoma slope after the initial stages of rapid degradation and thaw slumping. This stabilization occurs at a time span between years to decades and is coupled with decreased sediment and water input and improved drainage. The high-emitting revegetated Yedoma surfaces on Kurungnak were located in the middle part of the exposure with intermediate soil moisture content. That's that water-filled pore spaces we looked at earlier. as well as the high-emitting Yedoma surfaces revegetated with mosses in Divani Yar. The revegetated Yedoma surfaces with grasses in Divani Yar were located lower down the slope and had higher moisture content. The role of soil moisture as a primary environmental control on N2O fluxes and bell-shaped dependence of N2O fluxes on soil moisture peaking at the intermediate soil moisture range is well documented. At intermediate soil moisture content, both oxic and anoxic microsites coexist, providing suitable environments for the two main microbial processes responsible for N2O production in soils: aerobic nitrification, which is the oxidation of ammonium via nitrite, NO2 to NO3, and then N2O as byproduct. And then anaerobic denitrification, which is reduction of NO3, NO2 ions, nitrate, nitrite ion, to gaseous N forms NO, N2O, and N2. Now you see why I took the time to go through the nitrogen cycle. But this sums it up right here. This sums it up. So you've got the fact that the thawing plus a suitable amount, just the right amount of moisture that allows for both anaerobic and aerobic bacteria to do their thing. And from the two different processes, it encourages more production of various gaseous forms containing nitrogen, including NO, N2O, and N2 gas itself. Intermediate soil moisture content is also optimal for nitrogen mineralization and to release from organic matter as a result of microbial decomposition, which is suppressed by very wet or very dry soil conditions. At permafrost thaw sites, liberation of mineral nitrogen species from permafrost directly at thaw enhances nitrogen availability in the short term, but in the long term, post-thaw nitrogen mineralization is more important mechanisms of mineral nitrogen supply. The improved drainage and associated enhancement of nitrification was likely an important trigger for the substantial N2O release from post-thaw Yedoma. The net, this is on Karunak, the net nitrogen mineralization rates were higher in Yedoma revegetated with grasses versus barely freshly thawed. The negative net mineralization, either that means immobilization, right? That means you lock it up in tissues, as I explained to you earlier. In freshly thawed Yedoma can be explained by high uptake of mineral nitrogen species into microbial biomass, exceeding the rate of nitrogen liberated from organic matter. In contrast, high net nitrogen transformation rates in revegetated Yedoma indicate the microbial needs for mineral nitrogen are well met as a result of continued mineralization after thaw, allowing N2O emissions to occur even in the presence of plant nitrogen uptake. In other words, you have a whole bunch of conditions present that simply favor N2O, nitrous oxide emissions. Even stronger net immobilization than in freshly thawed Yedoma was found in vegetated Holocene cover, suggesting limited nitrogen mineralization in this dry soil. The increasing trend of post-thaw age was even stronger for net nitrification than for net mineralization. And they go on to talk about some of the chemistry involved, and they find, and they go into a little more into the weeds here, pun not intended, and then they talk about how the microbial community composition changes and so on, and then that's when they start looking at the genetics component. I'm not going to, I said I will put the URL in the comment section for those who are interested. I'm not a geneticist, so this is beyond my pay grade, as the cliche goes. Um, but that's what they talk about here. And then they go and they discuss what are the implications of the nitrogen losses. Well, we know what the implications are. You're going to increase N2O gases into, you're going to increase the fluxes into the atmosphere. And that's a strong greenhouse gas. So you're going to further increase the warming, plain and simple. So this is another reason why the Arctic is warming 3 to now perhaps 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. And so they then they do at the end, they go through an extended methodology, which again, for those interested, can you can then look at that for your own edification if you desire. So we basically have an understanding now that it's not just simply the ground thaws, there's some microbial activity, and N2O is released. That does take place, but there are other conditions, and how long the area has thawed out. What are the conditions? What type of vegetation cover is present or not? What's the moisture content? What's how much of the spaces, the pore spaces, are filled with water? What is the percentage? All of these are different factors, and as we just discussed, that promote the use of aerobic and anaerobic bacteria that in the various chemical processes there all help increase the release of more N2O, increase the flux rate of N2O to the atmosphere. And don't forget, while the N2O is being released, so is CO2 and methane. So you basically, as the permafrost is thawing, you have all sorts of microbial activity, creating ammonia, creating nitrites and nitrates, and then reversing the process, releasing gases, N2O, being one of them, along with the CO2 and the CH4. All these gases are being released to the atmosphere. All these gases are increasing in the concentration. The flux rates are increasing so that these gases their release rates are exponentiating, creating these lovely positive feedback loops I have discussed with you folks many, many, many times before, with the result that warming is greatly enhanced. So again, when you hear, if we stop burning carbon right now and stop emitting CO2, from burning fossil fuel, we can hold the warming at 1.5 or no more than 2. Bollocks. It ain't happening. Because all these positive feedback loops will ensure continued warming because the gases are warming the air, which furthers the thaw, which then furthers the release of more greenhouse gases. And of course, there's everything else that goes on, melting of the ice and etc., etc. So here is another piece of the puzzle of why what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic, and why this is more bad news, as far as where the planet is headed. So, as I said, I will leave the URL in the comments section. I hope you found this report informative. It gives you an idea of where we're headed, some of the other processes that are taking place that are probably not as well publicized or reported on. And that's what I'm doing here. And I want to also give a shout out to Beryl Simachek, who alerted me. She shared with me this report. So thank you, Beryl. And, this is important information. So until next time, thank you for your time. Hello folks, this is Jim here with Science Talk, asking you to please subscribe to my channel and to inform others of my channel and of the work that I do. Please share to social media platforms that you use. Also, as a reminder, don't forget to click the bell so that you know when I load up more videos. Finally, I ask that you support the work that I do by becoming a patron at patreon.com. Details in the description box below. Thank you for your support.